As the state of California uses prison slave labor to fight out of control wildfires, billionaires stand to gain tens of millions of dollars privatizing water sources.
I wanna start a revolution.
All right, guys, hello and welcome to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. Today we're going to jump into discussing the absolutely insane, the absolutely apocalyptic, Armageddon-esque fires going on right now in Los Angeles County. These are some of the worst that we've seen in several years of worst we've ever seen forest fires. And I thought this current event would be a great chance to not only discuss climate change and how capitalism and colonialism, settler colonialism, is causing or accelerating that climate change, but the way in which incarcerated individuals, prison slave labor, literal prison slave labor, is used not only to create billions of dollars in profit for the billionaire capitalist class, but is used to face the absolute worst excesses of pollution, of climate collapse, of climate injustice, right? This story of these fires in Los Angeles just really kind of brings a lot of different pieces all together, and how they, interact within the capitalist colonialist system. Gives us an opportunity to discuss a lot of different aspects of this, everything from industrial agriculture, the trend of billionaires buying up farmland and water resources, mass incarceration used as modern day slave labor, the failure of local governments as capitalism and empire continue to decline, right? This is just a really great magnifying glass on all of these different subjects and how they intersect. So through this video, I'm going to try and provide analysis through a couple of different articles about how all these things fit together as we go into a increasingly bleak climate future, right? So we'll go ahead and jump into our articles here, our source material here. This first article is from NPR. I know, National Public Radio. Maybe not one of the sources we use most often on this channel, because obviously it tends to have a liberal status quo slant. But I chose this article because it does take a pretty good look at the use of inmates to fight these fires in California, right? Very good entry point for us. So we'll go ahead and jump into this here, guys. It says, inmates are fighting California wildfires in long-running and controversial practice. More than 900 incarcerated people are among the more than 7,500 personnel helping fight the historic and destructive Southern California wildfires. As of today, 939 fire camp firefighters have been working around the clock, cutting fire lines and removing fuel from behind structures to slow fire spread, including 110 support staff, California's Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation said in a statement to NPR on Friday. One of the things about this use of incarcerated individuals, one, to do public services, highway cleanup, disaster relief, like in this, is it is used not just because these, a lot of times, private prisons stand to profit via state contract for doing these things, but it works as a nice, PR laundromat for mass incarceration. Mass incarceration, the use of prison slave labor, has become an increasingly relevant contemporary issue for many, many people, especially people who have incarcerated family members and know the ways in which up and down the board inmates are exploited, right? So, and this is beginning to change, but systems of fighting natural disasters, forest fires, and something like this, it's like a nice PR thing to hopefully change the minds or quell the misgivings people may have about for-profit in prison industrial complex, right? Increasingly, it's not working. We can have a discussion about that later. But that is one of the reasons why they do this, right? And of course, along with that is budget shortfalls and the unwillingness or the inability of the capitalist state, which is being, sucked dry, vampire-like, by the capitalist class, being unwilling or unable to have the personnel and the budgets in order to actually properly respond to these things, right? So going back in here, guys, says this is not a new practice. California has relied on incarcerated firefighters since 1915, and prison labor has been used to respond to emergencies and disasters nationwide for centuries, said Bianca Tilak, executive director of Worth Rises, a criminal justice advocacy organization. So this is part of a wider discussion. This has been going on for hundreds of years. Here we have 1915 for the implementation of the fire camps that California uses, but there is if you want to go back to before and immediately after the Civil War, slave labor of one form or another, obviously slave labor in this country due to the 13th Amendment, has taken on a different meaning, a different form, in the form of mass incarceration and the criminalization of poverty and drugs and things like that. But even before that, American slaves, American chattel slavery, one of its primary purposes was to build infrastructure, maintain infrastructure. In the case of after the Civil War, when the vagrancy laws were implemented, which recriminalized being black in the South, they rounded up all these former slaves that had been freed and said, well, you don't have a job and you don't have a home, and you don't have anywhere to be, so you're a vagrant, which means you're back in chains. They used them to rebuild the South after the catastrophe of the Civil War, right? The Union forces, it was by many, the Civil War is considered the first instance of total war, even before the truly modern era, right? And the South was devastated. Entire crops were burnt, infrastructure destroyed, canals drained. They even went and they would take, these railroad ties, the steel railroad lines, and they would rip up all the ties, the wood ties, and they'd create these huge fires, and then they'd heat the steel rail track for the trains up until it was white hot and malleable, and then they'd wrap them around the cypress trees down there. And if you go down to the South now, in some of the state parks, you can still see where the Union forces came through and tore up. So the South was decimated, so they used slaves to rebuild the South. They've used them for ongoing natural disasters and other emergencies, right? This is the long history of the United States as a settler colony, as a slave society, right? The first capital, meaning the first wealth, was first expropriated from the native population, which were then eradicated, and then that wealth was used to inherit in slaves who invest in slaves who then went on to provide in. I think there's been some estimates of trillions. Enslaved people provided trillions of dollars in the form of labor value added to the wealth of this country, right? So this genocide, the seizing of the land, this enslavement is the building blocks which made the United States one of the wealthiest countries in the history of the human species, right? And this legacy, these prisoners being used to stop forest fires is just another extension of that, right? California's Department of Correction says individuals who are part of this program are there voluntarily and are paid between $5.80 and $10.24 a day. Imagine getting paid $10 a day to fight forest fires. One of the most dangerous jobs you can have, being a firefighter. And you're not getting paid a firefighter's pay. You're not getting the benefits of a firefighter. You go straight back to jail with $10 in your pocket at the end of the day. That'll maybe get you, given how overpriced commissaries are, because all the commissaries are contracted to private for-profit industries now. Probably get you a can of soup and a ramen noodles. If we got any people that have been prior inmates and can tell me how expensive that commissary is, it would be appreciated. But I know it's expensive, and that $10 a day trying to save lives fighting forest fires is not going to get you very far, even at the commissary, right? Says with additional pay provided, during emergencies and in other circumstances. This controversial practice also fills critical personnel gaps, especially as California faces a future with longer and more destructive fire seasons due to climate change. Yeah, guys, climate change continues to be exacerbated. The Paris Climate Accord goal of 1.5 degrees. You'll have some pundits tell you that, like, oh, we're right on the line of failing to meet that obligation that we set, 10, 20 years ago. Most scientists will say we have blown right past it, and we are barreling towards 2 degrees. And at 2 degrees, the extreme weather events and climate catastrophes that we're seeing today are going to look pretty mild in comparison, right? This is a key point here in this next section, guys. Says, do they completely choose what they do? California is one of more than a dozen states that operates conservation camps, commonly known as fire camps, for incarcerated people to train to fight fires and to respond to other disasters. The program first established in 1915, but expanded during World War II after forestry staff left to fight the war. In the interim, incarcerated people, which have always historically been black and people of color, were tapped as replacements, and 41 camps were established. There are now 35 of these camps today. These firefighting crews are made up of incarcerated volunteers deemed physically and mentally fit, who have exhibited good behavior and follow the rules according to the Department of Corrections. They must also have 8 years or less remaining on their sentence. When they are not fighting fires, they also respond to floods and other disasters and emergencies. That's what we were talking about, guys. This is a long-standing practice that goes on in, I think, a dozen or more different states. Tyleck of Worth Rises questions how voluntary the assignments are given that California's Corrections Department, like many prisons across the country, require inmates to work. Prison labor programs generally have historical ties to the end of the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery except as a punishment for crime, an exception that prison rights advocates like Tyleck says allows for exploitative labor. Yeah, guys, so that's something we've talked about many times on this channel. The 13th Amendment, when you learn about the 13th Amendment in high school, even entry-level college courses, it ended slavery. And then maybe I'll talk about the 14th Amendment provides equal protection under the law despite race or whatever, right? The 13th Amendment does not abolish slavery. It abolishes chattel slavery, meaning slavery where you are literally bred and then owned as a human being by an individual for their profit, but it does not abolish slavery. You can still be subjected to, in this case, mandatory work via your prison sentence, via your prison, if you have committed a crime. And, I mean, this is verbatim. You guys know a lot of this ad nauseum, like you've heard this, but many haven't. If you are convicted of a crime, you can be enslaved and be forced to work, or be punished with things like solitary confinement, reduction in privileges. And our prisons are horrific. So the little things that you're able to achieve or get either through commissary or being able to go outside, any of these things, that could be quite literally the difference between life and death for a prisoner that's spending an extended period in our horrendous prison system, right? And along with this is why we ended up with mass incarceration. This right here, the 13th Amendment, you cannot be a slave unless you have been punished, unless it's as punishment for crime. This is why the war on drugs was created. The war on drugs was created to arrest people for pot and other drugs, which were namely going to be poor white trash or poor black people generally, or Latinos, right? Because it was mostly black people and Latinos were cannabis culture or heroin in the jazz clubs or pot with the hippies, anti-war movement. They wanted this to break up the different groups of resistance to the American Empire, and they wanted it as an excuse to fill prisons so they would have cheap, essentially free labor. I think the average pay for a prisoner that is doing a work release program are working through the prison is like $1 a day. You'd be like, oh, well, they're getting paid. That's not. It's slavery. $1 a day is meaningless. You will find $1 a day looking down at the sidewalk when you walk. Right. It's slavery, is what it is, and it is so endemic in this society that we have somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million people in prisons and jails in this country, right? And the vast majority of them are mandated to work, and the vast majority of those mandated to work either for the prisons themselves to reduce state expenditure for the housing of prisoners, right? Or they are used for private corporations. A good example is Idaho potatoes. Every part of the supply chain of Idaho potatoes is prison slave labor. Huge amounts of the textile industry for companies like Victoria's Secret is slave labor, right? And it goes on and on. Another big one recently is call centers. A lot of those times, if you get somebody on your line when you're calling to complain or whatever, a lot of times those are prisoners. And, one aspect I want to add to this is this slave labor. Slave labor has, other than being an egregious crime against humanity, has been one of the great enemies or, barriers to working class solidarity and development, right? Because when there are slaves, when you have a slave society, that means you have an army of workers that are paid nothing in order to do work. So as a result of that, everybody else's work is already devalued considerably from what it should actually be worth. Because you, in the case of the United States, have 1+ million people that work for free out of a labor pool of 100 million. That's 1%. It makes a difference, right? Over time. It's the same principle as to why the minimum wage, they never want to raise it, because if the minimum wage stays low, that means everyone else's work is devalued if the lowest worker gets paid that much. If the lowest worker gets paid enough to live, that means the next rung up and the next rung up and the next rung up of workers are going to have a better quality of living. It's a virtuous cycle of economics, right? So this is a slave society, and it has not changed. The entire backbone of the American economy is built on slavery, both here and abroad. Colonization, colonial practices like in Haiti, where the U.S. government has overthrown the government in Haiti or fucked around in Haiti 101 times. Why? Not because they give a shit about tiny little island, but because that island is the lowest paid workers in the Western Hemisphere, meaning if there was a revolt and suddenly those workers got paid substantially better, the general trend of overseas labor for all of those working in the Western Hemisphere is going to go up and be more expensive for the capitalist class, right? And this prison slave labor has been used, again, like I was saying, in the case of the call centers. Those call centers in the late 80s and through the 90s were marketed to American workers who were facing deindustrialization as, the next big thing. Like, we're moving beyond the monotony of textile and manufacturing work for more service-oriented economy. You've heard that. We're now a service-oriented economy. Part of that services, one of the better paying jobs in the service industry outside of retail was being in a call center. Those were considered good white-collar jobs through the late 80s and the early 90s. Most of that has been outsourced either overseas, particularly to India, but by and large also to call centers in prisons, right? So going on here, guys, I went on a tangent there, but it's all related. Everything is related. A 2018 Time investigation found that incarcerated firefighters are at a higher risk for serious injuries. They also are more than 4 times as likely to get cuts, bruises, or broken bones compared to professional firefighters working the same fires, the report found. They're also more than 8 times as likely to face injuries after inhaling smoke, ash, and other debris compared with other firefighters, the report said. So this is an important point I'll just touch on briefly. This goes along with, in my view, things like Cancer Row or throwaway zones, right? Where, those are where these big industrial particularly chemical giants, go into areas that are predominantly black and brown in poor neighborhoods, and they set up chemical refinement plants, stuff involving the development of plastics, experimental chemicals, all this stuff, and then they just get free range because these governments are owned by these corporations, essentially these state governments. So they just dump all these carcinogenic, cancer-causing, genetic mutation-causing chemicals into the surrounding environment and water table, and it predominantly affects black and brown people. They're throwaway communities, and these corporations know they're black and brown communities, and that's why they do it. Because in America, in the world, black and brown people, their lives are not worth as much as white people. Okay, and this goes along with that. They put these, and we'll find out, these firefighters, these incarcerated firefighters, they don't use hoses. They're the ones that get up in personal with the axes and clear the debris while it's still burning. And a lot of them are not getting productive equipment, just inhaling these chemicals or these particulates from the burns, and they end up with higher rates of lung injuries and long-term health complications because they are black and brown prisoners that no one in the wider society gives a shit about, who most people don't even know that there's incarcerated people doing this line of work, which is why we're having this video, right? So just another example of modern-day colonialism. Colonialism as it sits in the digital high-tech future, right? While most inmates receive little to no pay nationwide, incarcerated workers produce more than $2 billion a year in goods and commodities and over $9 billion a year in services for the maintenance of the prisons where they are warehoused. A 2022 joint report from the ACLU and the University of Chicago's Global Human Rights Clinic found. Since 2018, the year in which Colorado banned the use of unpaid prison labor, a movement emerged calling on states to change their constitutions to remove the 13th Amendment exception. And make no mistake, the people that were overseeing the Reconstruction era in the United States knew what they were doing when they passed this amendment. They knew what they were doing when they put in that clause, except as punishment for crime. Because they knew that the entire American economy was built on the spine of slave labor. And if you don't have that cheap slave labor as a jumping off point, as a base point, the rest of the economy begins to crumble as it exists today. Now, we could talk about having a transition to a more socialist, collectively owned and operated economy, and how slave labor would not necessarily be a tenant in that new economy, right? But as it exists, capitalist colonial economies need slave labor to survive. If they can't have slaves out now outright, they will do mass incarceration. If they can't do mass incarceration, they'll, keep colonial possessions like Puerto Rico or Indonesia or Haiti so politically unstable and cut down and bought up by capitalist dollars that the government does whatever they said, so that those people might as well be slave labor, even if they aren't necessarily in a prison or in chains, right? This is the foundation of capitalism. This is what built capitalism. Industrial capitalism would not have been possible if the colonial powers had not gone out and seized the land, boom, free capital, and seized human bodies, boom, more free capital, in order to build and congeal and expand the capital that was necessary to make the technological leaps towards industrialization. It's all part and parcel. Going to this next article here, this is from People's World, which is the newspaper for the Communist Party USA. I wanted to touch on this because it touches on a lot of aspects of what causes this fire, how the, climate change and racialized capitalism and industrial agriculture, which is, in my view, just the plantation system expanded to incredible heights, right? How all these things intersect and combine to one joint class struggle. So the comrade that wrote this, Cameron Harrison, did an excellent job at pointing out some very valid and succinct points. So we'll go ahead and jump in here, guys. Rising temperatures and decreased rainfall, both linked to climate change, are causing California's wildfire season to begin earlier and end later. The rains that typically bring an end to the fire season are delayed, resulting in fires burning into the winter months. Heavy Santa Ana winds and the threat of electrical equipment catching fire have left upwards of 450,000 residents without power. So I want to point out these Santa Ana winds. These are a normal cycle that happens. I'm not a meteorologist. I'm not a climatologist. But they happen going, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, going down the Pacific coast, and then they loop back around down through Latin America. And this is normal, but to have a time period of the year where wind speeds pick up. But they are picking up even faster than normal and are going on for longer than normal, coupled with dry conditions due to climate change. And the reason why this is happening is the same reason why we have these polar vortexes in the Midwest, where we'll have really unseasonably warm winters, and then suddenly it'll snow really hard and get really fucking cold, like colder than shit, like feels like negative 40 degrees. And you always have some right winger idiot be like, oh, see, look at all this snow. There's no climate change. What they don't understand is it's not, climate change isn't just, oh, it's getting warmer and there's less snow and there's less. It's the climate as a whole, meaning the wind currents, the ecology collapsing, crumbling, fraying at the edges, leading to collapse. So what's happening is you have these Gulf streams, you have these things like the Santa Ana winds, which balance the movement of warm and cold airs that keep everything nice and peachy and normal, right? These things are under extreme stress due to the increased temperature as a result of dumping CO2, which keeps the warming. You know all this, I hope. So these things are fluctuating and they're becoming volatile. So you get polar vortexes, you get cold snaps, you get increased intensity of Santa Ana winds, you get increased velocity and destructiveness and frequency of hurricanes because the Gulf streams cannot handle the heating and they are fucking close to collapsing. Okay. Anyway, so that is what's causing it. It's sort of the brief scientific synopsis as to why this is happening. The U.S. over its history has contributed far more to global emissions than any other country, including through the military. It's a key point here I wanted to size up for you guys. It says, which is the single largest producer of greenhouse gases, not industry. Although military industrial complex worldwide generally is still probably one of the biggest polluters. The U.S. military is the single biggest organizational contributor to climate change. It is the biggest single institution. Like if you want to say an institution is Walmart or the U.S. military or the U.S. Congress or the People's Republic of China's Congress or I don't fucking know, Amazon, like whatever, different institutions, different organizations, right? The single biggest polluting organization on the planet is the U.S. military. 900 military bases. 1 million standing troops plus reserve troops plus an endless amount of planes and fuel and missiles and bombs and dangerous chemicals, and it goes on and on and on, right? Single biggest institutional polluter. The biggest industries meaning not just one organization, a whole industry, would be, of course, fossil fuels and animal agriculture, which we will see later on in this video, right? U.S. fossil fuel giants have been aware for at least 50 years that their intensive extraction would lead to climate disaster, but chose to play down and misinterpret the evidence of climate change. If anything is clear by now, it's that the system that prioritizes short-term profits and private accumulation, capitalism, is not equipped to either prevent or adequately deal with extreme weather events. So capitalism is all about profit. If it not make profit, if it not make graph go up, we not do. If can't get new Armani suit and yacht, won't do. That's capitalism, guys. That is the whole system. Oh, I forgot. And if you try to fix it or change it, we'll beat your head in or shoot you. Okay, that's capitalism. Sorry, I forgot that very important state component, right? This is what capitalism is. It will not do anything unless it can make a profit. The only times in history that capitalism has solved problems is because everyday working class people and oppressed and marginalized people got pissed and they picked up guns or they picked up clubs or they put their hands in their pocket and said, we ain't working until you fucking fix this. It wasn't capitalism did that. It was despite capitalism that was done. Okay? So they are not going to fix the climate catastrophe. They will let the world burn and find a way to make profit off the world burning. That's disaster capitalism. They have a word for it. We can make more money if the world burns. Okay? They will rather watch the world burn and find out a way to profit off of that than actually fix the problem. Amid the apocalyptic fires, okay, so this is a key point here. Billionaires loot the public's water supply. Amid the apocalyptic fires, about 20% of fire hydrants were running dry, and access to water was scarcely found. Janice Quinones, head of the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, said that the upwards of 3 million gallons of water were available when the fire started, but the demand was 4 times greater than we've ever seen in our system due to the scale of the blaze. There simply was not enough surplus in the water supply to meet the scale of the disaster. An illustration of capitalist greed and private ownership of an important public resource, water highlights how capitalism prioritizes private accumulation over human need, even in times of crisis. Excuse me. Instead of ensuring sufficient supplies for the public benefit, the profit motive trumps all. The results are a disaster for workers and the general public. One billionaire couple, Stuart and Linda Resnick, own a massive share of California's water system, one that was largely paid for by the general public in the first place. The Resnicks are the biggest farm owners in California. They own 130 acres worth of farmland in the state, and nearly half of Americans buy at least one of their products. With a net worth of at least $8 billion, the Resnicks are raking in massive amounts of money as water prices are soaring in California. Their mega corporation, wonderful, how ironic, controls a whopping 57% of the Kern Water Bank, the most valuable water resource in the region so critical to America's fresh food supply. In the Central Valley, where the Resnicks have banked water underground, working class communities often made up of migrant farm workers and immigrants have little access to public water. Char Miller, the director of environmental analysis at Pomona College, told Forums. The Resnicks are so dominant in the disempowered communities at the other end of the scale that is tipped mightily against them. When we put the food on our plate, we rarely think about the hands that make it and the situation they are in. That's an injustice of unparalleled proportion. In Texas, another area stricken by drought and accessible water, multi-billionaire Elon Musk is nearly finished constructing a lithium refinery for his Tesla Corporation. This facility will demand up to 8 million gallons of water per day. It will be situated 20 miles from Corpus Christi, an area so dry the local water company distributes shower timers at high school football games. There's more here that we could go on with, guys. I was going to go at it from the budgeting aspect as well, but we're running over time. So I'll just end it here with this point. While California is burning, cannot talk today, guys. My God. There is a single billionaire family that owns the majority of the water and is raking in huge profits. They own the majority of the agricultural land. One of the biggest contributors to these wildfires out west is the agricultural system, where they drain aquifers, they over-irrigate their crops, they rip up ecosystems, they rip up prairies, they rip up wetlands, they rip up forests into these dry brush areas so that cattle can graze or so they can plant feed crops like soy and corn, which increases to a larger carbon footprint, which further heats the planet. If you don't think meat production is one of the number one biggest drivers of climate change, you're an idiot. You've probably seen these memes going around. It's like a cow grazing, and then they're like, imagine thinking a cow eating grass is bad for nature. That is nature. No, it isn't. No, it isn't. Nature was ripped apart, destroyed, oftentimes burned, to make room for the cows to eat grass, destroying biodiversity, releasing metric tons of carbon in the atmosphere, and then the whole industry downwind from that is filthy, polluting, destroys waterways, takes up all the arable land that we could be using for diverse crops and reforestation to grow soy and corn to feed these fucking animals that provide little to no nutritional value for us. Animal agriculture is destroying the planet. 90% of the occupied surface of the planet is used for animals, not for human beings. It's not cities. It's not people living. It's not people gardening. That's not what's causing climate change. It's fucking animal production. A good example, and I really have to cut this video short here, but a good example is in Iowa. In Iowa, we have 3 million people. We're a rural state. Not very many people, I know, right? There's some city, your city you live in might be bigger than a Iowa state. We have 3 million people in Iowa. Very rural. We have like 30 million hogs. Okay? Now, I want you to think about something. 30 million hogs eat a shit ton of grain. All the corn you see in Iowa, the famous corn, it's not for humans. It's for cows, for pork, which has very little nutritional content. Now, another thing I want you to think about. 3 million people in Iowa. Everybody that shits and pisses in the toilet in Iowa, that goes to a water treatment facility and gets cleaned up and then set back into the network or dumped into a river, mostly clean. The 30 million hogs and other livestock in the state of Iowa does not shit in the toilet. It shits into big piles, which then are put into tank truckers and sprayed all over the field, which then runs off into the fucking irrigation ditch, which then goes into the rivers and canals and kills all the fish and pollutes it and gives women breast cancer because the well water is so full of fucking nitrates it's deadly. It gives people cancer and genetic birth defects. And then it goes all the way down the Mississippi and goes into the Gulf of Mexico, where there's a 100 to 300 mile wide dead zone where nothing lives, not even algae. This industry is destroying us, and people like this newly emerging feudal landlord class, profit off of that destruction. Okay? These kids, Corpus Christi, water timers for their showers at their football games. Meanwhile, Elon Musk at his lithium refinery uses 8 million gallons of water in a single day. Climate change affects us working class people. It does not affect them. And they will never not have access to resources while they ask you and I to live in a burnt out, hurricane-swept, flooded hellscape where no life is possible. This is the reality. Climate change is class war. Climate change is slave labor to stop the forest fires. Climate change is the complete destruction of our environments. Climate change is the seizing of the land, turning us all into peasants that are forced to work the land and work the factories while feudal lords sit in their palaces, never even looking at the land while they get rich off of it. Everything is connected, guys. These forest fires are connected. Class wars connected. Prison slave labor, mass incarceration is connected. The police state that keeps that prison slave labor going is connected. And that cracks your head if you try to tell them stop destroying the planet. It's all connected. It's all one part of a big project called capitalism, colonialism, the project of fucking empire. But that's all I have for you guys. Running over time here again. Don't forget to like. Don't forget to subscribe. Drop a comment for the algorithm. Really appreciate you guys. Don't forget you can support my independent media work on Patreon at patreon.com/entitledmillennials. You can join me there for $1 a month. Hope to see you there. One-time donations through PayPal are greatly, greatly, greatly appreciated. You can donate at paypal.me/entitledmillennials. Like I said, guys, that's all I have for you. I love talking issues with you. I love hanging out with you. And I look forward to speaking with you all again real soon. Bye for now.
I wanna start